Many blame massive government spending for high inflation rates. But Democrats say government spending doesn't increase inflation, it actually reduces the national debt. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Brace yourselves. Inflation is at a 40-year high, and it's taking an even bigger bite out of your paycheck. Year-on-year inflation is now at 7.9%, and it's hurting the vast majority of Americans by increasing the price of everything, especially food and gas. That's bad news for families living paycheck to paycheck, but great news for supermarkets. As this billionaire supermarket CEO says, food inflation will only get worse. So what are you waiting for? Buy, buy, buy! It'll be just like Supermarket Sweep, plus the Hunger Games. Think of the ratings. Keep in mind that the high inflation rate being reported is from last month, before the most recent spike in gas and oil prices, so something to look forward to. According to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Americans will likely see another year of very uncomfortably high inflation. You know, uncomfortable, like a visit to the proctologist, which is sure what it feels like every time I have to fill up on gas. So, for those of you keeping score, in about a year, we've gone from there is no inflation to okay, there is inflation, but it's just temporary, to actually, inflation is good for you, but bad for the 1%. You know what? I prefer this. So what's being done? The Federal Reserve approved the first interest rate hike in more than 3 years, with potentially 6 more ahead. The Fed policymakers aim to make borrowing more expensive, so that consumers and businesses hold off on making any investments. Investments? People need a loan just to fill up their cars. But in theory, this would decrease demand and therefore prices. But it runs the risk of pushing the economy into a recession. That'd be bad for us. Unless the Puffington host says it's good for us, it's my most trusted news source. The important thing is, don't let a crisis go to waste. It's an election year. Republicans and conservative media are saying inflation is Biden's fault. They blame trillions of dollars of government spending, but according to Democrats, that's not true. President Biden says one big reason for inflation was the pandemic and the supply chain issues it caused, and another big reason for the inflation we've been seeing over the past year is last month's invasion of Ukraine.
The second big reason for inflation is Vladimir Putin and gas prices. Not a joke.
Well, I'm certainly not laughing. Biden is calling it Putin's price hike and is using TikTok stars to convince people. Okay, I might be laughing a little bit at that. But don't, because Biden is very upset.
I'm sick of this stuff. We have to talk about it because the American people think the reason for inflation is government spending more money. Simply not true.
Yeah, you idiots. Government spending has nothing to do with inflation. In fact, you should be thankful for government spending. It actually reduces the national debt. Not a joke. How are Democrats making this argument? I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. President Biden is getting a lot of heat for high inflation rates. Republicans have blamed high inflation on high government spending that increases our national debt. Or at least that's what you're led to believe. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi says it's the opposite. Government spending actually decreases our national debt.
It's important to dispel some of those who say, well, it's the government spending. No, it isn't. The government spending is doing the exact reverse, reducing the national debt. It is not inflationary.
She also said the rising gas prices are really Putin's gas hike. Nothing to do with Democrats' policies. Remember that when you go to the voting booth later this year. So how does more government spending reduce national debt? Well, you gotta spend money to make money. According to Pelosi, you need to invest in things like education and research. With big government spending, all things that were part of Biden's Build Back Better plan. Even the reduced version of that would have cost over $2 trillion. But That's been in limbo because of Republicans and Democrat Joe Manchin. But anyway, the point is, inflation is actually Republicans' fault. Pelosi argues that spending money on Build Back Better, or BBB, would have been good for the economy.
Some people say when you increase the national debt, you increase inflation. 17 Nobel laureates wrote that the way the BBB was written, with long-term investments and increasing the capacity of people to participate in our success, is non-inflationary. The Joint Tax Committee says that BBB will reduce the national debt by $100 billion in the first 10 years and $1 trillion in the second 10 years.
So Pelosi argues by spending more money, less people will be unemployed, so more taxes. They'll be making more stuff, so as supply increases, prices decrease, and so the BBB basically pays for itself. Does the economy work that way? More after the break. Welcome back. Democrats don't want to be blamed for high inflation and crippling debt, especially right before an election. So they blame Putin and other factors, not government spending. In fact, government spending decreases the national debt. And according to Pelosi, Biden has already been doing just that.
President Biden has been responsible for reducing the national debt by $1 trillion. That is a record that no other president can claim to make. Everything that we have done under his leadership has been paid for. He has not increased the national debt.
Is all that true? Let's first talk about Pelosi's claim about Biden reducing the national debt. She may have mixed up national debt with the federal budget deficit. They aren't the same thing. The national debt is how much money the government has borrowed overall. The federal budget deficit is how much money the government borrows in a year. Biden had claimed to be the only president ever to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a single year. While that's technically correct, he's missing context. Biden started his presidency during a pandemic, when trillions of dollars were already being spent in government stimulus. So as a result, the deficit will fall by more than $1 trillion this year, but it is not because President Biden took efforts to cut it. Congress passed $2 trillion in COVID relief in March 2020 to prevent a recession. Both parties piled on $900 billion more that December, and Democrats in March 2021 ladled out nearly $2 trillion more. The deficit is declining because Congress blew it out for 2 years. In other words, the deficit is going down, but only compared to the massive amount the government was borrowing during the worst of the pandemic. The national debt, however, is not going down. It's going up, because the federal government is still borrowing money. So what about inflation? Is inflation Putin and the pandemic's fault and not Biden's? Well, remember, we've been having high inflation long before Putin's troops pushed into Ukraine. So just blaming Putin doesn't entirely explain why we're still experiencing high inflation. It's true that the pandemic played a role. Inflation is up globally, but the US has seen one of the biggest inflation increases in the world. According to a former Obama economic advisor at Harvard University, the difference comes because the United States stimulus is in a category of its own. On top of the trillions spent to counter the pandemic under the Trump administration, the US is spending trillions more under the Biden administration. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, had the Build Back Better plan been passed, we'd be running billions of dollars more in deficit and debt. This is not a Republican or conservative argument. Larry Summers was Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary and Barack Obama's economic advisor. And Summers was in general supportive of Biden's stimulus bill, but he also said in February 2021 that there was a risk the stimulus spending will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. Why? Summers argued that according to some economic indicators, Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus was too big. It would basically add too much cash too quickly, which would overstimulate and overheat the economy. According to another Obama administration economist, overstimulating the economy causes too much money chasing too few goods, which leads to higher prices and shortages. Not just goods shortages, but also worker shortages. Sound familiar? Now, the argument that Pelosi and other supporters of Build Back Better make is that we need to look at things in the long run. Spending money on improving productivity would ultimately lower costs, which in turn lowers pressure from inflation. In theory, this makes sense. But funding such large programs requires a lot of taxes, which may not be enough to offset the costs, especially if we keep on passing multi-trillion-dollar bills. Add in a bunch of unanticipated catastrophes like COVID or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you can see how increasing government spending can run into a lot of risks. And now, there's another risk coming up, which is that in trying to correct massive inflation, the government could accidentally trigger a recession. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to unwind with a nice, relaxing trip to the proctologist. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this show, and I know you do, remember that we rely mainly on direct support from viewers like you, not on YouTube ad revenue. So please visit our new Locals community at americauncovered.locals.com. Become a supporter so you can help us keep making great episodes. So click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.